The bowl shattered against the stone floor, before Alara even understood she had dropped it. "Watch where you stand, you empty thing," snapped Priscilla, stepping back from the splash of broth, as if it might stain her more than it already had stained the hem of her dress. "Or do you not even have the sense to smell your own clumsiness?" Laughter rippled through the kitchen. Alara knelt at once, gathering the broken pieces with bare hands, saying nothing. She had learned long ago that silence healed faster than argument. Her fingers moved quickly over the cold stone, avoiding the sharp edges, while the other kitchen girls stepped around her without offering to help, the way people step around a fallen branch on a path they walk every day. She was 19 years old, and for 19 years, she had lived inside a truth that never softened no matter how many times she heard it. She had no scent, not a weak one, not a plain one, not one that needed training to notice, nothing. Where every wolf carried an invisible signature that told the world who they were, what they felt, whether they were kin or stranger, friend or threat. Alara carried silence. To the nose of any wolf who came near her, she simply was not there. In a world built by wolves who trusted their noses before their eyes, this made her something close to a ghost. She swept the last shard into her palm, and stood, tossing the pieces into the waste bin, without looking at anyone. The kitchen returned to its noise, pots clattering, orders being shouted from the hall, and Alara returned to her corner near the hearth, where she had spent most evenings of her life, peeling roots and scrubbing pans, while the rest of the pack lived somewhere she was never quite allowed to reach. She had not always accepted this quietly. As a child, she had cried about it, had begged her mother to explain why the healers who examined her kept frowning and whispering. Her mother, Wren, a soft-spoken woman with tired eyes, would only hold her and say, "There is nothing wrong with you, little one. The world simply has not learned how to see you yet." Alara had wanted to believe her. She still wanted to believe her, even now, 3 years after her mother had died in a hunting accident that nobody in the pack had properly explained. An accident that had happened suspiciously close to the northern border, on a night when Wren had told no one where she was going. Alara pushed the memory down, the way she pushed down most memories that hurt too much to hold in daylight. Today there was work to do. Today, like every day, the pack needed feeding, cleaning, tending, and she was one of the many small hands that kept the house from falling apart around the people who mattered. By mid-afternoon, the kitchen had grown unusually tense. Alpha Garrick, the leader of their pack, had sent word that supplies were to be doubled and every corridor scrubbed until it shone. Something important was happening. Something that made even the senior betas walk faster and speak in lower voices. "The Alpha King is coming," whispered one of the younger cooks, a girl named Della, her eyes wide, with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Kale Blackthorn himself. He's bringing his court here for the border talks." The name moved through the kitchen like a spark through dry grass. Every wolf pack in the region knew the name Kale Blackthorn. His territory stretched wider than any other. His warriors were said to be unmatched, and his own strength as an alpha was spoken of the way people speak of storms, with respect and a little fear. He had never taken a Luna. He had never claimed a mate. Rumors said he had searched every gathering, every festival, every neighboring pack for years, without finding the pull that would mark someone as his, and that the search had made him colder with each passing season. Alara kept her head down, and her hands busy, chopping vegetables at a steady rhythm, but she could not stop herself from listening. "They say he can smell a lie from across a room," Della continued, delighted by her own gossip. "They say his senses are the strongest of any alpha alive." "Then he will smell nothing at all when he passes her," said Priscilla, tilting her chin toward Alara without bothering to lower her voice. "Perhaps he'll think the kitchen keeps a very well-behaved ghost." More laughter. Ilara's knife did not slow. She had grown a kind of armor over the years, thin but sturdy, built from thousands of small cruelties that no longer landed as hard as they once had. Still, something in her chest tightened at the thought of an Alpha King walking these halls, someone whose senses were said to be sharper than anyone's, someone who would confirm, in front of important company, that she truly was as empty as everyone believed. She told herself it did not matter. She would not be seen. Alphas who visited on business did not concern themselves with kitchen staff, and Alpha Garrick would certainly make sure she was kept far from any room where dignitaries gathered. That was, after all, how things had always been. By evening, the entire pack house had been transformed. fresh flowers lined the main hall. The stone floors gleamed from scrubbing. Alpha Garrick paced the front steps in his finest coat, his mate beside him, both of them rehearsing greetings under their breath, like actors before a performance. Word came that the Alpha King's convoy had been spotted at the western ridge, and the whole pack gathered at the gates to watch the procession arrive. Ilara was not among them. She had been given a list of tasks meant to keep her occupied and out of sight for the entire evening, and she worked through them without complaint, moving between the kitchen and the storage cellar, carrying crates of preserved fruit and sacks of grain. It was hard work, but it kept her hands busy and her mind quiet, and there was a strange comfort in that. She did not see Cale Blackthorn arrive. She heard about it instead, in fragments carried back to the kitchen by breathless staff, who had caught glimpses through windows and doorways. "He's taller than any wolf I've ever seen," said one. "His eyes are like ice," said another. "Not cruel, just still, like something ancient. He barely looked at anyone, just walked straight past the Omegas who lined up to greet him." Ilara found herself listening more closely than she meant to, curious despite her better judgment. She had heard stories about the Alpha King her whole life, the way children hear stories about legendary hunters or long-dead kings. But stories were always distant things, safe to admire, because they never touched real life. Now the legend was somewhere in this very house, breathing the same air, and it made the whole building feel different, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. That night, after the formal welcome dinner had ended, and the important guests had retired to their guest chambers, the kitchen staff was finally allowed to eat. Ilara sat alone at the far end of the long wooden table, a bowl of thin stew in front of her, listening to the others discuss the evening's events with the kind of energy usually reserved for festivals. "Did you see the way he studied the room?" Della asked, practically bouncing in her seat, like he was searching for something. "He's looking for his mate," said an older cook named Ottilie, without looking up from her bread. "Everyone knows it. An alpha as powerful as him, unmated at his age, it isn't natural. His wolf must be restless. Maybe he'll find her here," Della said hopefully. "Wouldn't that be something?" "Our pack, chosen by the Alpha King." Priscilla, seated a few chairs down, laughed softly. "If he does, it certainly won't be anyone from this table." Her gaze flicked toward Ilara for half a second, just long enough to make her point, before she returned to her meal. Ilara said nothing. She ate her stew slowly, letting the conversation wash over her like rain on a roof, present but not quite touching her. She had long since stopped hoping for grand things. Hope, in her experience, only sharpened the disappointment that followed. It was safer to want small things: a warm meal, a quiet corner, a day without cruelty. After dinner, she was given one final task before she could retire for the night: deliver a tray of refreshments to the private receiving room, where several of the visiting dignitaries and Alpha Garrick's advisors were finishing a late discussion. It was meant to be a simple errand, in and out, unnoticed. She lifted the tray, balancing the pitcher of water and the small plates of dried fruit and bread, and made her way down the long corridor toward the receiving room, her soft shoes silent against the polished floor. The corridor was quiet at this hour, lit by a row of lanterns that cast long shadows against the walls. Ilara walked with her eyes forward, focused on not spilling anything, her mind already drifting toward sleep and the early morning that waited for her. She reached the heavy wooden door of the receiving room and paused, listening for a break in the conversation inside before entering. That was when the door opened from the other side. She had not expected anyone to be leaving so suddenly, and she stepped back instinctively, the tray wobbling in her hands. A tall figure filled the doorway, broad-shouldered, dressed in dark traveling clothes that still carried the dust of the road, despite the evening's formalities. She had only a moment to register his presence before she looked up, and found herself looking directly into a pair of eyes, so pale and so still, that they seemed to belong to something older than the man standing in front of her. Neither of them moved. Ilara felt her pulse jump in a way she did not understand, a strange awareness prickling across her skin, as if the air itself had changed. She had never stood this close to an alpha of his strength before, and some old, quiet part of her recognized the danger of it even as another part of her simply could not look away. The man's expression shifted, a small crease forming between his brows, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that had appeared without warning. His nostrils flared once, subtly, the way a wolf's did when searching for a scent, and Alara watched something flicker across his face, confusion, sharp and sudden, quickly hidden behind a composed mask. "Forgive me," she said quickly, lowering her eyes and stepping to the side to let him pass, her voice steady despite the sudden pounding in her chest. "I did not mean to block the door." He did not move. For a long moment, he simply stood there, studying her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the floor, and yet she found herself standing straighter under it instead of shrinking, some stubborn thread inside her refusing to bow completely. "What is your name?" he said at last. It was not quite a question, more like a demand spoken softly, as though he needed the answer more than he wanted to admit. "Alara," she answered, before she could stop herself. He said nothing else. He simply looked at her a moment longer, that furrow still between his brows, and then, as though catching himself doing something he should not be doing, he stepped past her and continued down the corridor without another word, his advisors trailing behind him, throwing curious glances back toward the Omega, left standing alone, with a tray of refreshments and a heart that would not slow down. Alara stood frozen for several seconds after he disappeared around the corner, trying to understand what had just happened. She had been looked at by important wolves before, dismissed, ignored, mocked, but never like that. Never with that particular kind of confusion, as though he had reached for something familiar and found only empty air where it should have been. She told herself it meant nothing. Perhaps he had simply been startled by the sudden encounter. Perhaps the dust of travel had irritated his senses. There were 100 ordinary explanations, and she reached for every one of them, because the alternative, the small flicker of something she did not dare to name, felt far too dangerous to hold on to. She delivered the tray to the receiving room, where the remaining advisors barely glanced at her, and returned to the kitchen, with her mind still tangled around the memory of those pale, searching eyes. She did not tell anyone what had happened. There was nothing to tell, she reminded herself. A brief encounter in a hallway, nothing more. But that night, lying on her narrow cot in the small shared room she occupied with 2 other kitchen girls, Alara stared up at the dark ceiling and found sleep slow to come. Somewhere in the guest wing of the pack house, the most powerful alpha in the region lay awake as well, staring at his own ceiling, turning over the same strange, impossible sensation that had struck him the moment their eyes met, and neither of them yet understood that the world they had known that morning was already beginning to change. Morning came too soon, as it always did. Alara rose before the sun, dressed in her plain work clothes, and made her way down to the kitchen, where the fires were already being lit for the day's meals. She expected the day to unfold, as every other day had, filled with chores and small humiliations, easily forgotten by nightfall. She had no way of knowing that the Alpha King had spent half the night questioning his own senses, pacing his guest chamber, replaying the moment in the corridor over and over, unable to explain why a girl with no scent at all had left him feeling more unsettled than any encounter he could remember. She had no way of knowing that, for the first time in years, Cale Blackthorn had felt something pull at the center of his chest, faint but unmistakable, the way a compass needle pulls toward north, even when the traveler refuses to believe the direction it points. And she certainly did not know that this single encounter, brief as it was, had already set something in motion that no amount of mockery, no amount of doubt, and no amount of fear would be able to stop. The kitchen filled with the usual noise as the day began, pots clattering, orders shouted, the scent of bread rising through the warm air. Alara took her place at the counter, sleeves rolled up, ready to disappear into her work the way she always did. But somewhere above her, in the quiet of the guest wing, a king stood at his window, staring out over the packlands he did not yet know, wondering why a nameless kitchen girl had managed to shake him more deeply than any battle he had ever fought. Breakfast preparations stretched into a long, sweaty hour of kneading dough and turning bacon over open flames, and Alara welcomed the distraction. Physical work had always been a kind of medicine for her, a way to keep her thoughts from wandering toward places that only brought pain. She measured flour, checked the ovens, and carried trays of warm bread out to the long tables where the senior staff would soon gather to eat before the household woke fully. It was there, in the dim early light of the dining hall, that she overheard 2 of Alpha Garrick's personal guards speaking in low voices near the doorway. The Alpha King barely slept, one of them muttered, glancing over his shoulder as though the words themselves were dangerous. His steward said he paced his chamber half the night. Trouble at the border, maybe, the other guessed. Or he's simply restless. Powerful alphas often are, especially unmated ones. He asked about someone this morning, a kitchen girl he crossed paths with last night. Elara's hands stilled over the bread basket she was arranging. She did not turn around, did not let her face show anything, but her heart began to beat harder against her ribs. A kitchen girl. The first guard repeated, sounding amused. The Alpha King? Asking after kitchen staff? That's a first. Steward said he wanted her name confirmed. Nothing more. Probably curiosity. You know how strange these powerful alphas can be, when their senses are unsettled by unfamiliar territory. The conversation drifted elsewhere, the guards moving off toward the front hall, and Elara let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding. She told herself again that it meant nothing, that important men asked idle questions all the time, and forgot them just as quickly. And yet the small, stubborn hope she had tried so hard to bury the night before stirred faintly in her chest, refusing to stay buried. She finished her morning duties and was sent, along with 2 other girls, to help prepare the receiving hall for a midday gathering. Alpha Garrick had announced that all pack members of standing were to attend a formal assembly, where matters of the border treaty would be discussed in general terms before the private negotiations continued behind closed doors. Kitchen staff were not expected to attend such things, of course, but extra hands were needed to arrange chairs, polish the long table, and set out refreshments before the guests arrived. The hall itself was grand by the pack standards, with high wooden beams and tall windows that let in wide bars of morning light. Elara worked quickly and quietly, arranging cups along the side table, careful not to draw attention to herself. Priscilla was there as well, dressed more finely than usual, clearly hoping to be noticed by someone important before the day ended. She cast occasional glances toward Elara, sharp and assessing, as though trying to determine whether the strange rumor now spreading through the staff quarters held any truth. "I heard the Alpha King ask about you," Priscilla said at last, unable to contain her curiosity any longer, though her tone remained mocking. "Strange, isn't it? A man who can smell truth from lies, curious about the one girl in this whole pack he could never truly sense." "I don't know what you're talking about," Elara replied evenly, continuing her work. "Of course you don't." Priscilla's smile did not reach her eyes. "Don't get any foolish ideas, Elara. Men like him don't concern themselves with girls like you. If anything, you probably confused him." Novelty wears off quickly. Elara did not answer. She had learned that responding to Priscilla only fed whatever satisfaction the other girl drew from these small cruelties, and today, with her thoughts already tangled and uncertain, she did not have the energy to spare. She finished arranging the cups and moved to the next task, keeping her eyes low and her expression calm, even as her mind kept circling back to a pair of pale eyes narrowed in confusion, searching for something they could not find. By midday, the hall filled with pack members of rank, along with the visiting delegation from the Alpha King's territory. Elara and the other serving staff were positioned along the back wall, ready to refill cups and carry away empty plates as needed, invisible in the way that servants were trained to be invisible. She kept her gaze fixed on her tasks, refusing to search the crowd for a familiar face, though the effort of not looking took more concentration than the work itself. The formal assembly proceeded much as such gatherings always did, filled with careful words and practiced courtesies, the kind of political dance that meant little to someone whose life revolved around kitchens and chores. Elara moved among the guests, refilling cups, murmuring polite apologies when necessary, and doing her best to remain unnoticed. She had almost convinced herself that yesterday's encounter had been a small, forgettable strangeness, nothing more than an alpha's senses, briefly confused by an unfamiliar scentless presence, when she felt it again, that same prickling awareness, crawling up the back of her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. She lifted her eyes without meaning to, and found him there, seated near the head of the long table among the other dignitaries, his expression composed and unreadable to anyone who did not know to look for the small details, the way his jaw had tightened slightly, the way his gaze had fixed on her, and refused to move, even as one of his advisors spoke beside him. Elara looked away quickly, her face warming despite her best efforts to stay calm, and busied herself with the nearest tray of empty cups. She did not look up again for the rest of the assembly, though she could feel, more than see, that his attention returned to her more than once throughout the long, careful hours of political discussion, and by the time the gathering finally ended and the guests began to disperse, she understood, with a mixture of dread and something she refused to name, that whatever had happened in that corridor the night before had not been a passing strangeness at all. It had been the beginning of something neither of them yet understood, and there would be no simple way to pretend otherwise once the rest of the pack began to notice it too. Cale Blackthorne did not sleep at all that second night. He sat in the dark of his guest chamber long after the candles had burned low, his elbows braced on his knees, staring at nothing while his wolf paced restlessly beneath his skin, agitated in a way it had not been in years. He had built his entire reputation on control. Warriors twice his age deferred to him, not only because of his strength, but because of the steadiness with which he wielded it, the calm that never cracked no matter the pressure placed upon it. And yet here he was, undone by a serving girl he had spoken to for less than a minute. It made no sense to him, and that lack of sense bothered him more than almost anything else. A mate bond revealed itself through scent first, always. That was the natural order of things, the way every wolf since the beginning of their kind had recognized the person fate had chosen for them. He had met hundreds of Omegas over the years, at gatherings, treaty negotiations, festivals arranged specifically to introduce him to potential matches, and none of them had ever caused so much as a flicker of recognition in his chest. He had begun to believe, quietly and privately, that perhaps fate had simply overlooked him, that he was meant to rule alone. Then he had opened a door and found a girl standing there, with a tray in her hands and no scent at all, and something in his chest had pulled so hard it had nearly knocked the breath out of him. It should not have been possible. A bond needed scent to anchor itself. Without scent, there was nothing for his senses to latch onto, no signature to recognize, and yet the pull remained, stubborn and undeniable, refusing to be explained away, no matter how many times he turned it over in his mind. By morning, he had convinced himself he needed to see her again, needed to test whether the sensation would repeat itself, or whether it had simply been some strange trick of exhaustion and unfamiliar territory. He told himself this was simple curiosity, the kind any alpha might feel toward an anomaly. He did not allow himself to consider what it might mean if the pull returned stronger than before. It returned exactly that way, the moment his eyes found her across the crowded assembly hall. He had barely followed a single word of the border discussion after that. His advisors had spoken of grazing rights and hunting boundaries and old disputes between neighboring territories, and he had nodded in the right places and offered brief, measured responses, all while his attention kept drifting toward the quiet girl moving along the back wall with a tray of cups, refilling drinks with steady hands and downcast eyes, as though she were trying very hard to be invisible. He noticed things about her that he should not have had reason to notice, the careful way she avoided drawing attention to herself, the slight stiffening of her shoulders whenever another servant spoke to her, as though bracing for something unkind. The single moment when their eyes met, and she looked away so quickly, it was almost as if she feared being caught looking at all. By the time the assembly ended, Cale had made a decision he knew would draw attention, and possibly criticism, but he found he no longer cared. He turned to his beta, Corwin, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, who had served at his side since they were both young, and spoke in a low voice meant only for him. Find out everything you can about the kitchen girl who served at the back of the hall, the one with dark hair, quiet manner. Her name is Alara. Corwin's brows lifted slightly, though he was too disciplined to ask questions openly in front of others. Any particular reason, my lord? Just do it, Cale said, and something in his tone made Corwin nod without further comment, though the curiosity in his expression lingered as he stepped away to begin his quiet inquiries. It did not take long for word to spread through the staff quarters that the Alpha King had specifically requested information about one of the kitchen girls, and it did not take long after that for the news to reach Alpha Garrick himself, who received it with a mixture of confusion and unease that he was careful to hide behind a diplomatic smile. Garrick summoned his personal advisor, an older beta named Ferris who had served the pack for decades, and spoke to him privately in his study that evening. The Alpha King is asking about the scentless girl, Garrick said, pacing behind his desk. Why would a man of his standing take interest in someone so unremarkable? Perhaps it is nothing more than curiosity, my lord, Ferris offered carefully. The girl's condition is unusual. It would not be strange for a powerful alpha to be intrigued by an anomaly, especially one his senses cannot properly categorize. See that she is kept far from him, Garrick said, his voice sharpening. The last thing this pack needs is an embarrassment during treaty negotiations. If the Alpha King begins asking uncomfortable questions about why we have a scentless Omega serving in our kitchens, it reflects poorly on our household. Keep her occupied elsewhere, far from the guest wing, far from any gathering he might attend. Ferris bowed and left to carry out the instruction, and by the following morning, Ilara found herself reassigned to the laundry house on the far side of the pack grounds, a building well removed from the main house and any of the formal spaces where the visiting dignitaries gathered. She did not question the sudden change, though she suspected, correctly, that it had something to do with the strange attention she had drawn over the past 2 days. If anything, the reassignment came as a relief. Distance meant safety. Distance meant she would not have to feel that unsettling pull of pale eyes searching her out across a crowded room, would not have to wonder what it meant, or why it frightened her as much as it did something else she was not yet ready to name. But distance, as it turned out, was not so easily arranged when fate had already made its decision. Kale learned of the reassignment within hours, delivered to him by Corwin along with a brief report on Ilara's background, what little of it existed in the pack's records. Orphaned mother, no father listed, born without scent, a condition the pack healers had documented but never explained. No formal training beyond basic kitchen duties, no standing, no status, nothing that would have made her notable in any ordinary circumstance. And yet Kale found himself unable to stop thinking about her, unable to shake the memory of that pull, and the deliberate effort to keep her hidden away only sharpened his suspicion that something important was being concealed, whether intentionally or not. He did not confront Alpha Garrick directly. Diplomacy required patience, and he had not survived years of careful rule by acting on impulse alone. Instead, he spent the following 2 days attending the formal negotiations with outward calm, discussing borders and trade routes and old grievances with the same measured focus he always brought to such matters, while privately turning the mystery of the scentless girl over and over in his mind, searching for an explanation that made sense. He asked his own pack healer, a woman named Idris who had traveled with his delegation, whether she had ever encountered a case like it. Scentlessness is exceedingly rare, Idris told him, studying an old text she had brought with her more out of habit than expectation of needing it. In most recorded cases, it stems from illness, from severe trauma to the senses at birth, or occasionally from deliberate suppression, though that requires powerful and specific magic, the kind not commonly practiced anymore. A natural, unexplained case, with no clear cause, would be unusual enough to warrant serious study. Suppression, Kale repeated, something sharpening in his chest at the word. You mean someone could hide a wolf's scent deliberately? In theory, yes, though it would require considerable skill and considerable reason. Scent suppression of that depth is not something done lightly. It would suggest someone wanted to hide the girl from detection entirely, perhaps to protect her from something, or someone. Kale said nothing for a long moment, turning the idea over carefully. It fit, in a strange way, with the timeline Corwin had uncovered. An orphaned girl whose mother had died under circumstances the local pack records described only briefly and vaguely. An accident near the northern border that no one seemed eager to discuss in detail. He did not yet have enough information to draw firm conclusions, but the pieces were beginning to suggest a shape, one far more complicated than a simple defect of birth, and he found that possibility settling into him, with a quiet, determined resolve. Whatever the truth was, he intended to find it. On the third evening of his visit, a formal banquet was arranged in his honor, the grandest event the pack had hosted in years, meant to celebrate the progress of the border negotiations, before the final details were settled the following day. The great hall was filled with candlelight and music, long tables laden with food, pack members dressed in their finest clothing, all eager to make a good impression on the most powerful alpha in the region. Ilara had not been assigned to serve at the banquet. She spent the evening instead in the laundry house, folding linens by lamplight, while the distant sound of music and celebration drifted faintly across the grounds, a reminder of a world she was never quite permitted to enter. She told herself she did not mind. She had grown used to standing outside such gatherings, watching the warm glow of candlelight through windows she was not invited to approach. And yet, as she worked through the quiet evening, she found her thoughts drifting again and again toward a pair of pale, searching eyes, and she wondered, despite every effort not to, what it might have felt like to stand in that hall tonight instead of here, folding linens alone in the dark. She did not yet know that across the grounds, in the middle of a hall filled with music and laughter, the Alpha King had grown increasingly distracted, his attention drifting toward the door every few minutes, as though waiting for someone who was never going to arrive, and that his patience, already thin from days of careful restraint, was beginning to wear through completely. Halfway through the banquet, Cale set down his cup and rose from his seat with a suddenness that silenced the nearest conversations. "Alpha Garrick," he said, his voice carrying easily across the hall despite its even tone. "I understand it is custom, when a visiting Alpha of rank attends such a gathering, for the household to present its full staff and standing members for formal greeting. I would like that custom observed tonight, before negotiations conclude tomorrow." Garrick's smile flickered, just barely, before settling back into place. "Of course, my lord. Though such a gathering would take considerable time to arrange properly. Perhaps tomorrow, once." "Tonight," Cale said, and though his tone remained pleasant, there was a weight beneath it that left no real room for argument. "I find I would like to know the household that has hosted me so generously." All of it. There was little Garrick could do but agree, and within the hour, word had spread through every corner of the pack grounds that the Alpha King had requested a full assembly of staff and standing members alike, an unusual, and, to many, unsettling request. Servants who had spent the evening working quietly in kitchens and storage rooms were summoned to change into their cleanest clothes and gather in the courtyard outside the great hall, where they would be presented in turn. Alara received the summons in the laundry house, delivered by a breathless younger girl, who clearly did not understand why such an order had been given, but was too excited by the novelty of it to question it. Alara's stomach tightened the moment she heard the words. She thought immediately of the pale eyes that had followed her across the assembly hall 2 days before, of the reassignment meant to keep her hidden, and some instinctive part of her understood, with a certainty she could not quite explain, that this sudden summons was not a coincidence. She considered, briefly, finding some excuse to avoid it. A sudden illness, an urgent task that could not wait. But summons from an Alpha King were not the sort of thing easily refused, not without drawing far more attention than simple compliance would, and so she smoothed her plain dress as best she could, tied back her hair, and made her way toward the courtyard with the other staff, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The courtyard was lit by rows of torches, casting long shadows across the gathered crowd. Servants and staff stood in loose lines according to their duties, kitchen workers here, groundskeepers there, laundry staff further along, all waiting with varying degrees of nervousness and curiosity, while the household's standing members formed a more orderly arrangement nearer the steps of the great hall. Alpha Garrick stood at the top of those steps beside his mate, both of them wearing expressions of careful composure that did not quite hide the tension beneath. Cale descended the steps slowly, Corwin a pace behind him, and began moving along the assembled lines, with the deliberate patience of someone conducting a genuine inspection, rather than simply performing a courtesy. He paused at each cluster of staff, exchanging brief words, nodding at introductions, his manner polite but distant, the manner of a man fulfilling an obligation, rather than pursuing genuine interest. Alara stood near the back of the kitchen line, positioned deliberately between 2 taller girls, in what she suspected was another small effort by the senior staff to keep her from easy view. She kept her eyes low, watching the flickering torchlight reflected on the stone ground, listening to the murmur of introductions drawing steadily closer. When Cale reached the kitchen staff, he paused longer than he had at any previous group, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled faces, with an intensity that made several of the younger girls shift uncomfortably. Priscilla, positioned near the front, straightened visibly, offering her most gracious smile as he approached, clearly hoping to be noticed. He barely looked at her. His attention had already moved past, scanning further down the line, searching for something, or someone, with an urgency he was visibly struggling to keep contained beneath his composed exterior. "Is this the full kitchen staff?" he asked, addressing the senior cook who stood nearest him. "Yes, my lord, all present," she answered, bowing slightly, though her eyes flicked, just briefly, toward the back of the line where Alara stood, partially hidden between the 2 taller girls. Cale's gaze followed that flicker of movement without hesitation. "You," he said, and though the word was quiet, it landed in the courtyard with the weight of a struck bell. Step forward. For a moment, Alara considered the impossible idea of simply not moving, of pretending the word had not been meant for her at all. But every eye in the courtyard had already turned toward her, the two girls beside her stepping aside, as though eager to distance themselves from whatever was about to happen, and there was nowhere left to hide. She stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling, and lifted her eyes to meet his. The moment their gazes locked, something shifted visibly across Cale's expression, the careful composure he had maintained throughout the evening, cracking just slightly at the edges. He closed the remaining distance between them with slow, deliberate steps, and the entire courtyard fell silent, watching, waiting, sensing that something significant was unfolding, even if they did not yet understand what. "Your name," he said again, though he already knew it, as though he needed to hear her say it aloud in front of everyone. "Alara," she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. He studied her for a long moment, close enough now that she could see the faint lines of exhaustion beneath his eyes, evidence of the sleepless nights that had followed their first encounter. Then, slowly, deliberately, he extended his hand toward her. "May I?" he said, and it was, remarkably, a genuine question, one that gave her the space to refuse if she chose. She did not fully understand what he was asking, but something in the stillness of the courtyard, in the held breath of every watching face, told her this was not a moment where refusal would be simple. She placed her hand in his, hesitant, uncertain, and the instant their skin touched, she felt it. A jolt, warm and electric, traveled up her arm and settled somewhere deep in her chest, a sensation so unfamiliar and so powerful that she nearly gasped aloud. Beside her, she heard Cale's breath catch, saw his eyes widen fractionally, before that same iron composure slammed back into place, though not quickly enough to hide what had just happened from anyone paying close attention. "It cannot be," someone whispered from the crowd, the words carrying further than intended in the sudden hush. Cale did not release her hand. He turned instead to face the gathered courtyard, his expression settling into something resolute and unshakable, the look of a man who had spent years searching for an answer, and had finally, against every expectation, found it. "This is my mate," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence. "Confirmed before witnesses, bond recognized, despite the absence of scent. I do not know yet how such a thing is possible, but I know what I feel, and I will not deny it out of convenience or comfort for anyone in this courtyard." The silence broke into chaos. Whispers turned to gasps, gasps to open exclamations of disbelief. Priscilla's face had gone pale, her earlier gracious smile long since vanished. Somewhere near the front, Alpha Garrick stood frozen at the top of the steps, his composed diplomatic mask cracking into something closer to panic as he tried to process the implications of what had just happened, in front of his most important guest, his own household, and the future of every treaty he had spent days carefully negotiating. Alara herself felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet, the noise of the crowd fading into a distant hum as she stared up at the man still holding her hand, the same man who had haunted her thoughts for 2 restless nights, now claiming, in front of everyone who had ever mocked her, that she was his fated mate. "This is impossible," she heard herself say, quiet enough that only he could hear it over the growing noise around them. "I have no scent. Bonds require." "I know what bonds require," he said, his voice low, meant only for her, though the intensity in it did not lessen. "I felt it the moment I saw you in that corridor. I have spent 2 nights trying to convince myself it was some trick of exhaustion, and I have failed every single time. Whatever explains the absence of your scent, it has not stopped this bond from forming, and I do not intend to pretend otherwise, simply because it is unusual." She searched his face for some sign of mockery, some hint that this was an elaborate cruelty, designed to humiliate her further, the kind of joke Priscilla and the others might have delighted in orchestrating. She found none. Only that same fierce, unwavering resolve, and beneath it, something almost vulnerable. A man who had spent years believing himself destined to rule alone, now confronted with the very thing he had stopped allowing himself to hope for. Alpha Garrick descended the steps quickly, his voice pitched carefully between diplomatic warmth and barely contained alarm. "My lord, surely there has been some misunderstanding. The girl is a kitchen servant of no standing. her condition an unfortunate anomaly we have long since accepted as. The girl, Cale said, cutting him off with a coldness that made Garrick fall silent immediately, is my mate. I would advise you to choose your next words carefully, Alpha Garrick, for they will determine a great deal about how our two packs proceed from this evening forward. Garrick's mouth closed. He glanced toward his advisors, toward the stunned crowd, toward the girl he had spent years allowing his household to treat as beneath notice, now standing hand in hand with the most powerful alpha in the region, and understood, with a sinking certainty, that whatever careful order he had built in his pack house had just been permanently upended. Ilara stood in the middle of it all, hands still held in Cale's steady grip, surrounded by faces that had spent her entire life looking at her with pity or disdain, now staring instead with a confusion so total it bordered on disbelief. She caught Priscilla's eye across the courtyard and saw, for the first time in years, something other than contempt there. Fear, perhaps, or the beginning of a very different kind of reckoning. I don't understand any of this, Ilara said quietly, still speaking only to Cale, the noise of the courtyard fading again into background static as she tried to steady the storm of emotions rising in her chest. Yesterday, I was nothing to anyone in this pack. Now you stand here calling me your mate in front of everyone. Then we will understand it together, he said, and though the words were simple, there was a quiet promise woven through them that she felt more than heard, a promise that whatever came next, she would not have to face it alone, the way she had faced everything else in her life until now. The torchlight flickered around them, the courtyard still buzzing with disbelief and whispered speculation, and somewhere beneath the chaos, Ilara felt the first fragile stirrings of something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time, the possibility that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet begin to imagine. The days that followed moved faster than Ilara could fully absorb. By the next morning, she had been moved out of the small shared room she had occupied with two other kitchen girls and into a private chamber in the guest wing, one with a real bed, clean linens, and a window that overlooked the eastern gardens instead of the laundry yard. The change felt less like an honor and more like being dropped into unfamiliar water without knowing how to swim, and she spent much of that first morning simply sitting on the edge of the unfamiliar bed, staring at her own hands, trying to make sense of how quickly everything had shifted. Word of the courtyard announcement had already spread through the entire pack by sunrise, and it did not take long to spread beyond it. Messengers rode out that same day to carry the news to neighboring territories, and within a week, it was certain that every pack within several days' travel would know that the powerful, long unmated Alpha King had claimed a mate no one had expected, a scentless kitchen girl from a minor pack near the southern hills. Not everyone received the news with excitement. It's unnatural, she overheard one of the senior betas mutter to another as she passed through the corridor on her second day in the guest wing, both men falling silent the instant they realized she had heard. She kept walking, pretending she hadn't, though the words settled uncomfortably in her chest, another small reminder that acceptance was not something granted simply because an Alpha King had declared it so. Alpha Garrick, for his part, had shifted his approach entirely once the shock of the announcement wore off. Where he had once ordered her kept hidden and reassigned to distant duties, he now seemed determined to present himself as having always recognized her worth, offering strained compliments and awkward attempts at warmth that fooled no one, least of all Ilara, who had spent too many years learning to read the difference between genuine kindness and careful self-interest. You must understand, he told her during a brief, uncomfortable audience in his study, the household is simply adjusting to unexpected news. Give it time, and everyone will come to see you as the pack now must, with the respect befitting your new position. Ilara said little in response, offering only polite, non-committal words, though privately, she doubted that respect could be summoned so easily, after years of the opposite. She had spent her whole life being told, in ways large and small, that she was less than everyone around her. A single announcement in a torchlit courtyard, however dramatic, could not undo 19 years of that lesson overnight, not in the pack, and not entirely within herself either. Cale, meanwhile, had thrown himself into managing the practical consequences of the bond, with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. He extended his stay at the pack house indefinitely, much to Alpha Garrick's poorly concealed dismay, insisting that the mate bond required time to properly establish itself before any further travel could be considered safe or appropriate. In truth, Ilara suspected, though she did not say so aloud, that he simply did not trust the household to treat her well once he was gone, and the suspicion, uncomfortable as it was to sit with, was not entirely unfounded. He came to find her each day, usually in the late afternoon once the day's negotiations and formal duties had concluded, and their conversations, awkward and uncertain at first, gradually began to soften into something more genuine. "You don't have to keep asking my permission for everything," she told him on the third afternoon, as they walked together along the edge of the eastern gardens, a pair of guards trailing at a respectful distance behind them. "I'm not made of glass." "I am aware of that," he said, a faint, almost reluctant smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But you have spent your entire life having decisions made for you, without your consent, by people who did not particularly care what you wanted. I do not intend to be another one of those people, however unfamiliar this bond may be to both of us." The words settled into her more deeply than she expected, and she found herself studying him with new curiosity, searching for the arrogance she had assumed must exist beneath the surface of any alpha, powerful enough to hold the title he held. She found, instead, a kind of careful deliberateness, a man who weighed his words before speaking them, who seemed genuinely troubled by the years of casual cruelty she had endured, and unwilling to add even a small measure of carelessness to that history. "Why me?" she asked eventually, the question she had been circling for days finally slipping free. "Out of every Omega in every pack you've visited over the years, why would fate choose someone with nothing to offer? No scent, no standing, no family of any real name." Cale stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression serious in a way that made her breath catch slightly. "I don't fully understand the mechanics of it myself," he admitted. "My own healer believes your lack of scent may not be a natural defect at all, but something suppressed, hidden deliberately, perhaps to protect you from something or someone. If that is true, then whatever you believe you lack may not be the truth of what you are at all, merely the truth of what has been hidden from you." Ilara felt something cold settle in her stomach at the words, old questions about her mother's death rising unbidden to the surface of her mind. She had never allowed herself to seriously entertain the idea that her scentlessness was anything other than a simple, unfortunate flaw, a piece of bad luck she had been born with and would carry for the rest of her life. The suggestion that it might instead be something imposed upon her, hidden by design, opened a door she was not entirely certain she wanted to walk through. "My mother," she said slowly, testing the words as they left her mouth, "died when I was 16. An accident, they told me, near the northern border. She never explained much about her past to me, only that there was nothing wrong with me, that the world simply hadn't learned to see me properly yet." Cale's expression sharpened with quiet interest. "Do you know anything else about her? Where she came from, before she joined this pack?" Ilara shook her head slowly. "She never spoke of it. I always assumed there was simply nothing worth telling." "Perhaps," Cale said, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe it. "Or perhaps there was a great deal worth telling, and she chose silence to keep you safe from it." The conversation lingered in Ilara's mind long after it ended, a small seed of unease planted alongside the strange, fragile hope that had begun to grow since the courtyard announcement. She had spent her whole life believing herself to be exactly what everyone told her she was, empty, lesser, a mistake of birth that the world had quietly agreed to overlook. The idea that there might be more beneath that surface, something deliberately hidden rather than simply absent, was both terrifying and, in a way she did not fully understand yet, quietly thrilling. That evening, as she sat alone in her new chamber watching the sun set over the eastern gardens, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find Corwin standing in the corridor, his expression carefully neutral in the practiced way of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. "My lord asked me to inform you," he said, "that his healer has requested a formal examination, to better understand the nature of your condition. It would require your consent, of course, and can be scheduled whenever you feel ready. There is no obligation." Ilara considered the offer for a long moment, old fear warring with the new, fragile curiosity that had taken root since her conversation with Cale. For years, healers had examined her only to shake their heads and offer no real answers. Each failed attempt another small confirmation that she was simply broken in a way no one could explain or fix. But this time felt different, somehow. This time, someone was not looking for confirmation that something was wrong with her. They were looking for the truth of what had been done to her. And to hidden truth, unlike broken things, there was always the possibility of being found. "Tell her I'll come tomorrow," Ilara said finally, and closed the door behind Corwin, with a strange new steadiness settling into her chest. The first real step toward answers she had spent her entire life believing she would never be allowed to have. The healer's chamber had been set up in one of the guest wing's quieter rooms, its shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and old careworn books, the air carrying a faint scent of sage and something sharper underneath, medicinal and unfamiliar. Idris greeted Ilara with a warmth that surprised her, gesturing toward a padded chair near the window rather than the cold examination table she had half expected. "There is nothing to fear here," Idris said, settling into the seat across from her with an easy, unhurried manner. "I only wish to understand, not to judge. May I ask you some questions first, before anything else?" Ilara nodded, some of the tension in her shoulders easing slightly at the woman's gentle tone. "Do you remember your earliest years clearly? Anything unusual from before your mother passed?" Ilara thought carefully, reaching back through memories that had grown hazy with time. "Not really. My mother kept mostly to herself. We lived on the edge of the packlands, away from most of the others. I remember she used to make me drink a bitter tea every morning, said it was good for my health. I stopped when she died, since no one else knew the recipe." Idris straightened slightly at this, exchanging a brief glance with Kale, who stood near the doorway, arms crossed, listening intently. "A tea," Idris repeated. "Do you recall anything about it? Its color, its scent, any herbs you recognized?" "It was dark," Ilara said slowly, the memory surfacing with unexpected clarity now that she reached for it deliberately. "Almost black. It smelled like burnt roots, something bitter and heavy. I hated it, but she insisted every single morning, without fail." "That is significant," Idris said, turning to retrieve one of the old books from her shelf, flipping through its yellowed pages with practiced familiarity. "There are certain rare suppression tonics, old recipes, mostly forgotten now, that when taken consistently over years, can mask a wolf's scent entirely. They are difficult to prepare, require specific and often dangerous ingredients, and are typically only used in cases where a family fears exposure or pursuit." "Pursuit," Ilara repeated, a chill settling over her despite the warm afternoon light streaming through the window. "Why would anyone need to hide me from being found?" Idris did not answer immediately, continuing to study her book with a furrowed brow, and it was Kale who finally spoke, his voice carefully measured. "There are old bloodlines, Ilara, ones considered dangerous by certain packs generations ago, wolves whose strength or abilities set them apart in ways that made others fearful or greedy. If your mother believed you carried such a bloodline, hiding your scent might have been the only way to protect you from being sought out." "Sought out by who?" "I don't know yet," Kale admitted, "but I intend to find out." Idris continued her examination with careful, methodical attention, testing Ilara's reflexes, her senses, asking her to describe any unusual sensations she had experienced throughout her life, moments of heightened awareness, strange dreams, flashes of instinct she could not explain. Ilara found herself recalling small things she had never thought worth mentioning to anyone, a strange calm that settled over her during moments of real danger, an occasional sense of knowing things before they happened that she had always dismissed as coincidence or imagination. "These are not nothing," Idris said finally, closing her book with quiet resolve. "Taken individually, they might be dismissed. Taken together, alongside a lifelong suppression of scent and a mother who died under circumstances no one seems willing to fully explain, they suggest something far more deliberate than an accident of birth." The examination left Ilara with more questions than answers, but also, unexpectedly, with a strange sense of relief. For the first time in her life, someone was treating her scentlessness not as a flaw to be pitied or mocked, but as a mystery worth solving, evidence of something, rather than an absence of something. She left the healer's chamber that afternoon, walking a little taller than she had walked in years, though the unease of not knowing what, exactly, had been hidden from her, and why, followed close behind. That unease found new fuel only 2 days later, when a small disturbance in the kitchen reached her ears, through one of the few staff members who still spoke to her with any real warmth, a young girl named Sable, who had always treated Alara with quiet kindness, even when it was unpopular to do so. Priscilla's been saying things, Sable told her, finding her alone in the garden one afternoon, glancing around nervously before continuing, claiming the bond isn't real, that the Alpha King only claimed you to embarrass Alpha Garrick, or that you tricked him somehow with some kind of charm. She's been telling anyone who'll listen. Alara felt a familiar tightness settle in her chest, old and painfully recognizable. It doesn't surprise me. There's more, Sable said, lowering her voice further. I heard her talking with a few of the other girls, saying something about making sure the bond doesn't last, that powerful men lose interest quickly once the novelty fades, and that all it would take is the right kind of trouble to remind him what he's really tied himself to. What kind of trouble? Sable shook her head. I don't know exactly. I only caught part of it before they noticed me listening. But I thought you should know, in case something happens. Alara thanked her quietly, though the warning settled uneasily over the rest of her day, a reminder that whatever fragile progress had been made since the courtyard announcement, not everyone in the pack had accepted it, and some, it seemed, were actively working against it. She considered telling Kale, but hesitated, unwilling to seem as though she required constant protection, unwilling to give Priscilla the satisfaction of disrupting even a moment of the peace she had only just begun to find. She would come to regret that hesitation only a few days later, when the trouble Sable had warned her about finally arrived, sharper and more dangerous than she had allowed herself to imagine. The trouble arrived on a quiet evening, nearly a week later, dressed up as an invitation. A folded note appeared beneath Alara's chamber door, unsigned, written in a careful, unfamiliar hand, asking her to meet at the old stone bridge on the eastern edge of the property after sunset, claiming to carry information about her mother that could not safely be shared any other way. Alara read it twice, her pulse quickening with a mixture of hope and caution. She knew better than to trust anonymous notes, especially given the warning Sable had passed along days earlier, and yet the mention of her mother pulled at something too deep and too raw to easily dismiss. She almost told Kale. She stood outside his chamber door for several long minutes that evening, note in hand, before deciding, foolishly, that she wanted to see for herself first, unwilling to drag him into what might turn out to be nothing more than a cruel prank, designed to embarrass her further. She left a brief message with one of the household staff, saying only that she was taking a walk in the eastern gardens, and set out alone into the gathering dusk. The stone bridge stood at the edge of the property, arching over a narrow, fast-moving stream that marked the boundary between cultivated packlands and the wilder forest beyond. Alara arrived to find it empty, the evening quiet except for the rush of water beneath the old stones and the distant call of birds settling into the trees for the night. She waited, arms wrapped around herself against the cooling air, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. She did not hear the footsteps approach from behind until it was almost too late. A hand closed roughly around her arm, spinning her around, and she found herself face to face with two figures she recognized immediately. Priscilla, her expression twisted with something far uglier than the casual cruelty Alara had grown used to, and a broad-shouldered young man Alara vaguely recognized as one of Priscilla's cousins, a low-ranking guard named Osric. "Did you really think," Priscilla said, her voice low and sharp, "that a mate bond could simply erase years of what you are? You are nothing, Alara. A defect the pack tolerated out of pity. Nothing more. The moment the Alpha King grows bored of his little novelty, you'll be discarded, and everyone will remember exactly what you always were." "Let go of me," Alara said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, despite the fear tightening her chest. "Not yet," Priscilla said, her grip tightening. "I want him to see exactly what he's tied himself to. A frightened, scentless nothing, who can't even fight off two people at a quiet bridge. Perhaps that will finally shake loose whatever foolish notion has taken hold of him." Osric moved to grab her other arm, and Alara, driven by pure instinct rather than any conscious plan, twisted hard against Priscilla's grip, breaking free just enough to stumble back toward the edge of the bridge. Her heel caught against a loose stone, and for one terrifying moment, she felt herself losing balance entirely, the rushing water below suddenly far closer than it should have been. She never hit the water. A sound like tearing silk ripped through the evening air, and something inside her chest, something that had lain dormant and unnoticed for her entire life, surged upward, with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. The world around her seemed to slow, colors sharpening, the rush of the stream beneath her growing impossibly loud, and when her feet finally found solid stone again, she was standing upright, untouched, several feet from where she had stumbled, as though some invisible force had simply set her back down. Priscilla and Osric stared at her, with matching expressions of shock, their earlier confidence draining visibly from their faces. "What?" Priscilla breathed, taking an unconscious step backward. "Was that?" Alara did not know the answer herself, her whole body still humming with strange, unfamiliar energy, her senses sharper than she had ever experienced, every sound and scent and movement around her suddenly vivid, in a way that left her equal parts exhilarated and terrified. She had no time to process it fully, before the sound of running footsteps approached from the direction of the pack house, and Cale burst through the tree line moments later, his expression carved from pure alarm, Corwin close behind him. He must have realized something was wrong, she thought distantly, must have sensed it through whatever thread now connected them, even from across the grounds. His eyes swept the scene in an instant, taking in Priscilla and Osric's frozen postures, Ilara standing untouched near the edge of the bridge, and something in his expression shifted into cold, controlled fury. "Explain," he said, his voice deceptively quiet, the kind of quiet that promised consequences far worse than shouting ever could. Priscilla stammered out a hasty, half-formed excuse about simply wanting to speak with Ilara privately, but the lie was thin and obvious, and Cale's expression did not soften in the slightest as he listened. Osric said nothing at all, his eyes fixed on the ground, clearly understanding that whatever punishment awaited them, protest would not lessen it. "You lured her here, under false pretenses," Cale said, laid hands on her against her will, and attempted to cause her harm. "In my territory, such an act would result in immediate and severe consequences. I will speak with Alpha Garrick tonight about how such matters are handled here, and I expect the response to reflect the seriousness of what has occurred." Guards arrived shortly after, summoned by Corwin, and Priscilla and Osric were led away, Priscilla casting one final, venomous glance back toward Ilara, before disappearing into the darkness beyond the torchlight. Cale turned immediately to Ilara, his fury softening into something far more careful and concerned, as he studied her closely, searching for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hands hovering near her shoulders, as though unsure whether touching her would help, or simply add to whatever shock she was clearly still processing. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook slightly, betraying the truth of just how unfine she actually felt. "Something happened. When I almost fell, something inside me, it just reacted. I don't understand what it was." Cale's expression sharpened with a mixture of concern and fierce, urgent interest. "Can you describe it?" "Power," she said slowly, searching for words to describe a sensation she had never experienced before. Like something that had been sleeping woke up all at once. I've never felt anything like it in my life. Cale was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her feel, for once, not exposed or judged, but seen in a way she had never quite been seen before. "Whatever your mother suppressed within you," he said finally, "it did not disappear. It has simply been waiting, all this time, for the right moment to surface. And tonight, it seems, that moment finally arrived." They walked back toward the pack house together in silence, Ilara's mind racing through the implications of what had just happened, her body still thrumming faintly with the after-effects of whatever strange power had surged through her at the bridge. She did not yet understand what it meant, or how deep it ran, but she understood, with sudden and undeniable clarity, that the girl who had spent 19 years believing herself empty was not empty at all, and that whatever had been hidden inside her for so long was only beginning to make itself known. Alpha Garrick's response to the incident at the bridge came swiftly, driven less by genuine outrage and more by clear anxiety over the political consequences of angering his powerful guest further. Priscilla and Osric were stripped of their positions within the household and banished from the packlands entirely, given until sunrise to gather their belongings and leave, a punishment severe enough to send a ripple of shock through the remaining staff, many of whom began treating Ilara with a new, careful wariness that fell somewhere between respect and fear. Ilara found she did not particularly enjoy either reaction. She had spent so many years wanting simply to be seen as ordinary, and now, it seemed, Ordinary was no longer an option available to her. Kale, meanwhile, had grown increasingly determined to uncover the full truth behind her mother's suppression tonic and the mysterious circumstances of her death. 2 days after the bridge incident, he called a private meeting in his guest chamber, gathering Corwin, Idris, and Alara herself around a small table where several old documents lay spread out, records Corwin had spent the previous days quietly gathering from the pack's archives. "Your mother's death was recorded as a hunting accident," Corwin said, sliding one of the documents toward Alara. "But the details are strangely sparse. No witnesses listed, no clear account of what she was hunting, or why she was near the northern border alone, well outside the territory typically patrolled by this pack." Alara studied the brief, formal record, her mother's name written in careful official script, above a description so vague it told her almost nothing she did not already know. "She never went to the northern border," Alara said slowly, memory surfacing unbidden. "Not that I ever knew of. She avoided it, actually. I remember asking once why we never traveled that direction, even for gathering herbs, and she told me it wasn't safe." "Yet the record claims that is precisely where she died," Idris said, frowning at the document. "That is either a significant coincidence or a deliberate falsehood." "There's more," Corwin said, producing a second document, older and more worn than the first. "This is a fragment of a record from nearly 20 years ago, from a pack much further north, one that no longer exists under that name. It documents the dissolution of a bloodline believed to carry rare, dangerous abilities, wolves capable of what the record calls unnatural strength beyond normal pack limits. The pack was disbanded following an internal conflict, its surviving members scattered, some hunted by rival packs who feared the abilities they carried." Alara's chest tightened as she took the fragment from him, scanning the faded script. It mentioned little by way of specific names, most of the relevant details lost to time or deliberately erased, but one phrase caught her attention immediately, referring to descendants of the bloodline as marked by an absence, a lack of scent believed to accompany their unique strength, a trait some among the disbanded pack had apparently viewed as sacred and others as cursed. "You think my mother came from this bloodline," Alara said quietly. "I think it is possible," Corwin said carefully. "And if she did, and if she fled here specifically to hide from packs that once hunted her kind, then her death, near the northern border, in a location she reportedly avoided, raises serious questions about whether that accident was truly an accident at all." The implications settled over the room heavily, and Alara found herself staring down at the old, fragile document, trying to reconcile the mother she remembered, soft-spoken, careful, always urging Alara toward quiet safety, with the possibility that she had once belonged to a bloodline, powerful enough to be hunted across territories. "If someone found her," Alara said slowly, working through the thought as she spoke it aloud, "if someone tracked her here, after all those years of hiding, and killed her, to eliminate the bloodline entirely, then whoever did that might still be searching. They might already know I exist." The room fell silent at the weight of that possibility. Kale, who had remained quiet throughout much of the discussion, finally spoke, his voice low and resolute. "Which is precisely why I intend to increase security around you immediately, and why we will need to determine, as quickly as possible, exactly what abilities this bloodline carries, and how to help you control them, before anyone hostile has the opportunity to exploit either your uncertainty or your vulnerability." "I'm not vulnerable," Alara said, a flash of something fierce rising unexpectedly in her chest, surprising even herself with its intensity. "Whatever happened at the bridge, it protected me. Whatever is inside me, it's not weak." "No," Kale agreed, something like pride flickering briefly across his expression. "It is not weak at all, but it is untrained, and untrained power, however strong, can be dangerous, both to its owner and to those around them, if it surfaces without warning or control. I would rather you learn to master it deliberately than have it force itself forward again during a moment of crisis, as it did at the bridge." Idris nodded in agreement, already flipping through her worn book in search of any additional information on the old bloodline, any hints about training methods or the specific nature of the abilities it carried. Over the following days, Alara found herself spending long hours with Idris, practicing small exercises meant to help her sense and gently coax forward whatever power lay dormant within her, guided meditation, careful breathing techniques, small tests of reflex and instinct, designed to help her recognize the sensation before it overwhelmed her the way it had at the bridge. Progress came slowly, frustratingly so, though small breakthroughs began to accumulate. She learned to sense a faint hum beneath her skin during moments of calm focus, a quiet reservoir of energy she had never noticed before, simply because she had never known to look for it. She practiced drawing small amounts of it forward, deliberately, rather than in reaction to danger, feeling her senses sharpen briefly each time, before the power settled back into stillness. Cale attended many of these sessions himself, watching with quiet, careful attention, occasionally offering guidance drawn from his own years of disciplined control over his alpha strength. Their time together during these sessions deepened something between them that had begun tentatively in the Eastern Gardens days before, a growing comfort and trust built not on grand declarations but on small, steady moments. His patience, as she stumbled through difficult exercises, her willingness to let him see her at her most uncertain and unpolished. "You're doing well," he told her one afternoon, after she had successfully drawn forward a faint shimmer of energy around her hands, holding it steady for several seconds before it faded. "Better than I expected, given how recently this has surfaced." "I don't feel like I'm doing well," she admitted, breathing hard from the effort of concentration. "I feel like I'm chasing something I don't understand, trying to control a stranger living inside my own body." "That's normal," he said gently. "Power like this doesn't arrive with an instruction manual. It takes time to learn its shape, its limits, its voice. You are not required to master it overnight." She appreciated, more than she could easily express, that he never made her feel foolish for struggling, never treated her uncertainty as weakness, the way so many others in her life had treated even her smallest stumbles. It was a small kindness, perhaps, compared to the enormity of everything else happening around her, but it mattered more than almost anything else he had done since the courtyard announcement. Nearly 2 weeks after the bridge incident, Corwin returned from a quiet inquiry he had undertaken at Cale's request, traveling briefly to a nearby settlement, known to house older wolves, with long memories of the region's history. He returned with grim news, delivered privately to Cale and Alara together, in the same guest chamber, where their earlier discoveries had taken place. "There are rumors," Corwin said carefully, "of a hunting party that passed through the northern border region around the time of Alara's mother's death, wolves not affiliated with any local pack, asking careful questions about a scentless woman rumored to be living quietly somewhere in the southern territories. The old wolf I spoke with remembered the questions specifically because they struck him as unusual at the time, though he had no reason to connect them to anything until I asked." "Do we know who sent them?" Cale asked, his jaw tight. "Not yet," Corwin admitted. "But if such a party was searching for her 17 years ago, and if they succeeded in finding and eliminating her, it stands to reason they, or whoever commanded them, may not yet be aware that she left behind a daughter. The suppression tonic would have kept Alara hidden from any scent-based tracking for her entire life, until now." Alara felt a cold weight settle over her at the realization. The bond with Cale, the very thing that had finally given her a place in the world after a lifetime of exclusion, had also stripped away the invisible protection her mother had spent years carefully maintaining. Word of a scentless mate, claimed publicly by the Alpha King, had already spread across multiple territories. If the people who had hunted her mother were still watching, still searching, they would not need long to make the connection. "Then we have very little time," Cale said, his voice hardening with resolve, "to prepare you properly, before whoever is out there decides to come looking." Cale doubled the guard around the pack house within the hour, stationing warriors from his own delegation at every entrance and along the perimeter of the grounds, much to Alpha Garrick's visible discomfort, though the man wisely chose not to protest, given everything that had already occurred during the visit. Alara found herself both grateful for the protection and unsettled by the sudden constant presence of armed guards trailing her every movement, a reminder that the danger surrounding her was no longer theoretical. The following days passed in a strange, tense rhythm, training sessions with Idris growing longer and more intense, guards shadowing her through every corridor, Cale's own vigilance sharpening into something close to constant watchfulness. She understood the necessity of it, even as the weight of being guarded so closely began to feel, at times, like a different kind of cage than the one she had grown used to living inside. "I spent my whole life invisible," she told Kale one evening, as they walked the halls together after another long training session, guards trailing at a careful distance behind them. Now I can't move without someone watching every step. I don't know which feels stranger. I know it isn't easy, Kale said, his voice gentle, despite the exhaustion evident in his own posture. The strain of days spent managing both political negotiations and the mounting threat against her clearly taking its toll. But I would rather you feel smothered by caution than exposed to something we cannot undo. She understood the logic of it, even as some stubborn part of her chafed against the constant supervision, the reminder that whatever power had surged forward at the bridge remained largely untested, unreliable, not yet something she could summon and control at will. The threat, when it finally arrived, came not from the northern border as they had expected, but from within the Packlands themselves, a realization that would later strike Alara as darkly appropriate given everything else that had happened since Kale's arrival. It began with a fire. Alara woke in the middle of the night to the sound of shouting and the acrid smell of smoke curling beneath her chamber door. Faint at first, then unmistakable. She scrambled from bed, pulling on the nearest clothing she could find, and had barely reached the door when it burst open from the outside, one of Kale's guards standing there, with urgent alarm written across his face. "Fire in the western storehouse, my lady," he said quickly, already ushering her out into the corridor. "The Alpha King has ordered you move to the central hall immediately, away from any exterior walls until we determine the cause." The corridor outside was chaos, staff and pack members rushing in every direction, some carrying buckets toward the source of the smoke, others simply fleeing the confusion in a panic. Alara allowed herself to be guided quickly through the maze of hallways, her heart pounding, the strange hum of dormant power beneath her skin, stirring with unfamiliar restlessness, in response to the danger pressing in around her. They had nearly reached the central hall, when the guard escorting her suddenly stiffened, his hand flying to the blade at his hip, his eyes fixed on something in the shadows ahead. Alara followed his gaze and felt her blood run cold at the sight of two unfamiliar figures emerging from a side corridor, dressed in dark, nondescript clothing that marked them clearly as strangers to the household, their movements too controlled, too deliberate, to belong to panicked staff fleeing a fire. "Get behind me," the guard said sharply. But before he could position himself properly, one of the strangers moved with startling speed, striking him hard enough to send him crashing into the wall, momentarily stunned. Alara did not wait to see what happened next. Every instinct she had spent the past weeks trying to carefully cultivate surged forward at once, unbidden and overwhelming, the same electric power that had saved her at the bridge roaring to life beneath her skin. The second stranger lunged toward her, and she reacted on pure reflex, throwing her hands up defensively, and a sudden wave of force rippled outward from her, knocking the man backward into the wall with enough strength to leave him gasping on the ground. The first stranger recovered quickly, drawing a short blade and advancing with grim determination despite his companion's sudden defeat. Alara backed away, her mind racing, the power inside her still humming, but no longer responding with the same automatic force as before, leaving her fumbling to summon it deliberately, even as the danger closed in. "Alara." Kale's voice cut through the chaos like a blade of its own, and a heartbeat later he was there, moving with a speed and lethal precision that left the remaining stranger no real chance at all, subduing him within seconds and pinning him firmly against the corridor wall, his expression carved from cold, controlled fury. "Who sent you?" Kale demanded, his voice low and dangerous in a way Alara had never heard from him before. The stranger said nothing, his jaw clenched tight, and Kale's grip visibly tightened before Corwin arrived moments later with additional guards, taking both captured intruders into custody, while others rushed to finally extinguish the fire that had clearly been set as a deliberate distraction. Alara stood frozen against the wall, her whole body still trembling from the aftermath of the encounter, watching as Kale turned to face her, his expression shifting instantly from cold fury to fierce, urgent concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, closing the distance between them in a few quick strides, his hands finding her shoulders, checking her carefully for any sign of injury. "I'm fine," she managed, though her voice shook noticeably. "The power, it came again, but I couldn't hold on to it after the first strike. I don't understand why it works sometimes and not others." "It will take time," Kale said, though the strain in his own voice betrayed how deeply the attack had rattled him despite his composed exterior. "But we do not have unlimited time anymore, it seems. Whoever sent these two clearly knows exactly where to find you, and clearly considers you enough of a threat to risk an attack this bold, inside a pack house under my own protection." The captured intruders, once questioned by Corwin and Cale's most trusted warriors, revealed little of use, refusing to name whoever had sent them, despite considerable pressure, though a few fragments of information emerged from their scattered, reluctant answers. They had been hired through an intermediary, paid well for the task of eliminating a scentless target before her abilities could fully mature, following instructions that suggested whoever commanded them had detailed, specific knowledge of the old bloodline and its dangers, knowledge that only someone deeply connected to its history could possibly possess. "This wasn't random," Cale said grimly, once the interrogation concluded, and he and Alara sat together in the relative quiet of his guest chamber in the early hours of the morning, both of them too shaken to consider sleep. "Whoever ordered this attack knew precisely what you are, and precisely why you needed to be eliminated quickly, before your abilities fully awaken. That means the same forces that hunted your mother 17 years ago are still active, still watching, and now, thanks to the public nature of our bond, they know exactly where to find you." Alara sat in silence for a long moment, processing the weight of everything that had happened in the span of a single night: the fire, the attack, the realization that her mother's death had not been a distant tragedy safely buried in the past, but the opening chapter of a threat that had simply been waiting, patiently, for her to be found. "Then I need to stop hiding from what I am," she said finally, a new resolve settling into her voice, despite the exhaustion weighing down every part of her. "If they're coming for me, because of this bloodline, then I need to understand it fully, master it fully, instead of stumbling through it one crisis at a time." Cale studied her for a long moment, something like fierce, quiet pride flickering across his tired features. "Then we will make certain you have every resource necessary to do exactly that, whatever it takes." Outside, the first gray light of dawn had begun to creep over the packlands, the acrid smell of smoke still lingering faintly in the air, a quiet reminder that the danger surrounding them had only just begun to reveal its true shape, and that whatever came next would demand far more of Alara than survival alone. The following days brought a shift in Alara's training that left little room for gentleness. Idris, working now alongside Cale himself, adjusted their methods to prepare her not for slow, careful discovery, but for the real possibility of another attack, one that might not be stopped as quickly as the last. "You cannot rely on instinct alone," Cale told her, during one of their sessions in the training yard behind the guest wing, the morning air still cool, mist clinging to the grass beneath their feet. "Instinct saved you twice, but it is unpredictable, and unpredictable power fails precisely when you need it most. You must learn to call it forward deliberately, the same way you would draw breath." Alara nodded, steadying herself the way Idris had taught her, focusing inward, toward that quiet hum beneath her skin, reaching for it with deliberate intention, rather than waiting for danger to summon it against her will. It came more easily than it had, even a few days before, a warm current rising through her chest and settling into her hands, visible now as a faint shimmer of pale light gathering around her fingers. "Good," Cale said, watching closely. "Now hold it. Don't let it surge and fade. Keep it steady." She concentrated, sweat beading at her temples with the effort, and managed to hold the shimmer in place for nearly 10 seconds before it flickered and dissolved, leaving her breathless and slightly dizzy. "Better than yesterday," Idris said encouragingly, making a note in the small journal she had taken to carrying throughout their sessions. "Each day your control grows stronger. Whatever this ability is, it responds well to practice, unlike some gifts that resist training entirely." Progress continued steadily over the following week, though an undercurrent of tension remained constant beneath the surface of every session. The knowledge that whoever had sent the intruders remained unidentified, still out there, still watching, likely already planning a second attempt now that the first had failed. Cale had increased security further still, sending riders to patrol the surrounding territory and establishing a network of watchers along the border regions most likely to be used by anyone approaching with hostile intent. The second attack, when it came, arrived with none of the careful subtlety of the first. It happened during a formal gathering held to mark the final signing of the border treaty between the two packs, an event attended by dignitaries from several neighboring territories. The great hall filled once again with candlelight and careful diplomacy. Alara stood near Kale's side throughout the ceremony, her presence now formally acknowledged as his intended mate, the earlier chaos and controversy of the courtyard announcement having settled, at least outwardly, into cautious acceptance. The attack began without warning, a sudden surge of unfamiliar wolves breaching the outer perimeter, moving with coordinated, ruthless efficiency that spoke of careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. Shouts of alarm rippled through the hall as guards scrambled to respond, and within moments, the peaceful gathering dissolved into chaos, guests fleeing toward the exits while warriors moved to intercept the intruders now pressing toward the heart of the hall. Kale positioned himself immediately in front of Alara, his own wolf surging visibly beneath the surface of his composed exterior, ready to meet the threat head-on. But the attackers, it quickly became clear, had not come for him at all. Their focus remained fixed entirely on Alara, 3 of them breaking away from the main confrontation, to circle around toward her position, moving with a speed that outpaced even Kale's ability to fully block their approach. "Behind me," Kale commanded, but the words came a fraction too late, one of the attackers already closing the final distance, blade raised. Alara did not think, she simply reacted, the power beneath her skin surging forward with a force greater than anything she had summoned before, born not from careful practice, but from raw, desperate necessity. Light erupted around her, pale and blinding, and the attacker's blade shattered against an invisible barrier that had formed instinctively around her, the force of the impact throwing him backward across the hall. The remaining 2 attackers hesitated, clearly unprepared for the display of power now radiating from the very target they had been sent to eliminate, and in that moment of hesitation, Kale moved, swift and merciless, ending the threat they posed before they could recover their nerve. The battle in the hall continued only a few minutes longer, Kale's warriors, reinforced by Alpha Garrick's own guards once the initial shock wore off, quickly overwhelming the remaining intruders. When the last of the attackers had been subdued, an uneasy silence settled over the wrecked hall, shattered glass, and overturned tables scattered across the floor, the air still crackling faintly with the after-effects of the power Alara had unleashed. She stood in the center of it all, breathing hard, the pale light around her slowly fading as the surge of energy settled back beneath her skin, leaving her trembling with exhaustion, but very much alive. Every eye in the hall, guests and pack members alike, stared at her with expressions ranging from awe to open fear, the display of raw power impossible now to dismiss or explain away. Alpha Garrick approached slowly, his own expression caught somewhere between shock and wary calculation. "What exactly," he asked carefully, "have we been hosting in this pack house?" It was Kale who answered, stepping forward to stand beside Alara, his hand finding hers with quiet, steady certainty, despite the chaos still settling around them. "You have been hosting the last surviving heir of a bloodline, once thought entirely extinguished, a bloodline powerful enough to be hunted across generations by those who feared what it represented. And you have been hosting my mate, whose strength, as you have just witnessed, is far greater than anyone in this pack ever imagined." One of the captured attackers, wounded but alive, was dragged forward under guard, and it was Corwin who finally extracted the answer they had been searching for since the first attack weeks before. The orders, it turned out, had originated from a rival faction within a distant northern territory, one that had spent generations believing the old bloodline represented an unacceptable threat to their own power, a faction that had hunted Alara's mother to what they believed was a successful conclusion 17 years earlier, only to now discover, far too late, that a daughter had survived and grown into her inheritance after all. "They will not stop simply because tonight's attempt has failed," Corwin warned, once the interrogation concluded. "If anything, this failure will only convince them of exactly how dangerous she has become." Alara, still weary from the battle but steadier now than she had felt in weeks, looked around at the wrecked hall, at the faces still watching her with a mixture of fear and something new, something that looked, unmistakably, like respect. "Then let them come," she said quietly, though her voice carried clearly through the silent hall. "I spent 19 years being told I was nothing, that I would never be anything worth noticing. I am done hiding from what I am, simply because it frightens people who never bothered to understand it." Kale's hand tightened around hers, and though his expression remained serious, there was fierce pride burning behind his pale eyes, the look of a man watching the woman he loved step fully, finally, into the strength that had always belonged to her. In the weeks that followed, word of the battle in the Great Hall spread far beyond the borders of Alpha Garrick's small territory, carried by traders and travelers, until it reached nearly every pack within reach of the northern trade routes. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always did, but at its core remained a truth no amount of exaggeration could diminish. A scentless Omega, once mocked and dismissed by her own pack, had revealed herself to carry the strength of an ancient bloodline, powerful enough to shatter a coordinated attack with nothing more than her bare hands, and the will to protect what she had only just begun to claim as her own. Kale made the decision, in the days following the attack, to formally relocate Alara to his own territory, where the full resources of his pack could be brought to bear, both in continuing her training and in protecting her from whatever remained of the faction that had hunted her family for so long. Idris traveled with them, along with several of Kale's most trusted warriors, and Alpha Garrick, whatever his private feelings about the sudden loss of political leverage the arrangement represented, offered no resistance, having learned well enough by now not to stand in the way of anything the Alpha King had decided upon. The journey north took the better part of a week, and Alara spent much of it staring out at unfamiliar landscapes rolling past, feeling the strange, quiet wonder of a life reshaping itself so completely that the girl who had once scrubbed pots in a forgotten corner of a minor pack house barely recognized herself anymore. She was not yet fully in control of her power, not yet entirely certain of everything she was capable of, but she no longer feared it the way she once had, and that alone felt like its own kind of victory. Kale's own territory, when they finally arrived, proved larger and grander than anything Alara had imagined, a sprawling pack house built into the side of a forested mountain, surrounded by lands that stretched further than the eye could easily follow. The pack that greeted them received the news of their Alpha King's mate with far less hostility than Alara had feared, curiosity and quiet respect outweighing any lingering unease about her unusual condition, the story of her strength at the border pack house having already reached them well before her arrival. Over the following months, Alara settled into a life that would have seemed impossible to imagine only a season before. She continued her training with Idris, her control over her abilities growing steadier and more refined with each passing week, until she could summon the shimmering light at will, shape it into a protective barrier, channel it into bursts of focused strength when the situation demanded. She learned, too, to simply exist within it, to let the quiet hum beneath her skin become a familiar companion rather than a frightening stranger. Corwin's continued investigation eventually uncovered the full identity of the faction responsible for the attacks, a splinter group operating from a remote northern stronghold, led by an aging Alpha who had spent decades nursing old fears about the bloodline's power, fears rooted more in ancient superstition than in any genuine threat Alara's family had ever posed. Kale, with careful diplomacy backed by the unmistakable strength Alara had demonstrated, negotiated a resolution that neither required war nor left the threat unaddressed, isolating the faction politically and economically until its remaining influence withered into irrelevance, its aging leader eventually forced into quiet retirement by his own increasingly nervous followers. The formal ceremony marking Alara's position as Luna of Kale's territory took place nearly a year after their first encounter in that quiet hallway, held in the great hall of his mountain pack house before representatives from every allied territory in the region, including, notably, a delegation from Alpha Garrick's pack, sent specifically at Alara's own invitation. Sable stood among that delegation, having accepted Alara's offer to join her household staff in a position of genuine respect and responsibility. The quiet kindness she had once shown finally returned in full. Priscilla was not among them, her banishment years earlier having led her to a distant territory where, according to occasional rumors that reached the pack, she had found considerably less success and considerably less admiration than she had once enjoyed at Alpha Garrick's expense. Alara stood at the center of the great hall that evening, dressed not in the plain, worn clothing of a kitchen servant, but in robes befitting the position she had earned through strength no one could any longer deny. Kale beside her, his hand steady in hers, the mate bond between them settled now into something deep and unshakable, rather than the fragile, uncertain thing it had been in that first courtyard encounter. "A year ago," Cale said, addressing the gathered hall, his voice carrying easily across the silent room. "Many of you heard the story of a scentless Omega, mocked by her own pack, dismissed as broken, as nothing worth noticing. Tonight, I present to you, not that story, but its truth. Alara is not broken. She never was. She carries the strength of a bloodline older and more powerful than most of us can fully comprehend, and she has proven, time and again, that true strength is not measured by what the nose can detect, but by what the heart and spirit can withstand." Alara looked out across the crowded hall, at faces that had traveled great distances to witness this moment, and felt, for the first time in her entire life, the quiet, settled certainty of belonging somewhere fully, completely, without qualification or pity. She thought, briefly, of her mother, of the years spent hiding, of the bitter tea consumed each morning to keep her safe from a danger she had never fully understood until now, and felt a deep, grateful ache settle in her chest, wishing her mother could have lived to see this moment, to see the daughter she had protected finally standing tall in her own strength. "To those who mocked me," Alara said, her own voice steady and clear as it carried through the silent hall, "I hold no anger. You could not see what you were never taught to look for, but I hope you remember this lesson, wherever you carry it forward. What the nose cannot detect, the heart still knows. And sometimes, the quietest, most overlooked among us, carry the greatest strength of all, waiting only for the right moment, and the right person, to finally help it find its voice." The hall erupted into applause, warm and genuine, and as Cale drew her close, sealing their bond with a promise spoken quietly enough that only she could hear it, Alara felt the last remnants of the frightened, scentless girl, who had once knelt on a kitchen floor gathering broken pottery, finally settle into peace, replaced by a woman who had learned, against every expectation placed upon her, exactly what she was truly capable of becoming. Outside, beyond the tall windows of the great hall, the mountain night stretched wide and quiet under a sky full of stars, and somewhere in that vast darkness, a new chapter of her story was only just beginning, one built not on mockery or doubt, but on strength finally recognized, a bond finally honored, and a future finally, fully, her own.